Okay, good afternoon, everyone. This is Andy Reese with the Department on Disability Services. Happy National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which we still have 1 week left of. Our numbers here may be a little bit low today because today is also the Employment First Summit, which is happening at Martin Luther King Jr. Library right now, up the street from here. And I hear that attendance there has been really strong today, which is wonderful. And we are going to try something new today. We have our fingers crossed for it. The Employment Summit at lunchtime has an awards event, and they are going to log into our meeting when that event begins, which is scheduled for about 12:30. But we do also have a presenter at the beginning, Robin Schaffer with the University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities will be providing information about disability rights in employment, and has so much information that she's going to be able to flex her time a little to cover us until we pick up at the Employment First Summit, which is where Robin is right now. We also, in the remainder of the month, I want to remind people that next week is the Mayor's Disability Career Fair, also at MLK Library. And that is, well, the mayor will be there at 11 a.m., but I'm pretty certain that's an all-day event. It's on my calendar at 11 a.m. But please join us for the Mayor's Disability Career Fair. We will have a number of employers, including district government agencies. And we are coordinating with the Department of Employment Services for our first Disability Career Fair, the first Mayor's Disability Career Fair. So we're really looking forward to that next week. That's all I have. And so I will now turn it over to Robin to talk about disability employment rights.
Good afternoon, everyone. Charlisa is going to share my slides, but I'm going to join Andy in wishing everybody a happy National Disability Employment Awareness Month. There you see it. And I'm going to ask Charlisa to go to the next slide. One of the groups that sponsors or does a lot of work around National Disability Employment Awareness Month is the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the United States Department of Labor. And every year they pick a theme, and this year's theme, this is the poster for it. What we're working towards this year is access to good jobs for all. And I think this is a really important theme because it kind of underscores what's really important, which is that people with disabilities can do and should work in all kinds of different jobs, and everyone should have a job that that person thinks is a good job for that person. And part of a good job is that it's a good job as part of a career. So you see a lot of potential for the future. You see opportunities to use things you've learned in school and in other places, and you like what you do. That's a good job. So let's go to the next slide, please. So disability employment, I just want to start by underscoring that employment, a job, is important for everyone, people with disabilities and people without disabilities, and for a lot of different reasons. And sometimes our reasons that it's important to us vary over the course of our career. A job can be a means to make a living. It can pay for necessary supports, services, and healthcare. And what we have to remember is really important is it's not just about the money. It's the way we fully engage and participate in society. It's one of the ways we can make a difference in the world. It's a way we meet people. It's a way we show our strengths and weaknesses in lots of different ways. So employment is very important. And people with disabilities are not employed are often unemployed or underemployed. So one of our goals at the Georgetown University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities and the other advocacy organizations in DC is increasing and improving employment outcomes for DC residents with disabilities. And a part of that is knowing what some of your rights are and what the law says. So I'm going to give you a lot of information over the next half an hour or so. This isn't legal advice, it's information sharing, but we'll talk a little bit if we have time about where else you can go for more resources. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal law passed in 1990, and the DC Human Rights Act prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities in employment. An employer cannot say they won't hire you because you're disabled. They can't give you fewer rights in employment because you're disabled. So let's go to the next slide, please. I'm going to go through a little bit more detail here, and we're going to have to do some definitions to kind of get to the meat of this. So employers are required to provide qualified individuals with disabilities and equal opportunity to benefit from the full range of employment-related opportunities available to others. So equal opportunities in employment. The ADA and the DC Human Rights Act restrict the questions that an employer can ask about an applicant's disability. I'm not going to spend the time today to go into, a lot of detail on that, but that's kind of something we can do another presentation about sometimes. The questions that can be asked vary during the stage of employment and based on some of the facts of what's going on, but there are restrictions on what can be asked. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations to the known physical or mental limitations of other qualified individuals with disabilities unless it results in undue hardship. So that's what we're going to focus on today, that reasonable accommodation. So let's go to the next slide, please. There are three key terms that I want to make sure we understand before we go into this. So what is under the ADA, what is a person with a disability? Different laws define disability differently. The ADA definition is a broad definition. A person with a disability is a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It's a person who has a history or a record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment, somebody who's regarded as having a disability, somebody who has a history of disability, and somebody who currently has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. The ADA doesn't include a laundry list of disabilities. The statute and the regulations provide a lot of examples and a lot of information about what constitutes a disability, but it's not like just a diagnosis is in or out. So it's a broad definition. There are people who are going to be considered disabled under the ADA who might not qualify for Social Security disability, who might not qualify for services from the Developmental Disability Administration, but they have the rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act not to be discriminated against in employment. And then the ADA is broader than that, so it covers other things as well. So disability is a broad term. It includes people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It includes people who are deaf or hard of hearing. It includes people who have cancer, epilepsy, a lot of physical impairments, a lot, mobility impairments, a lot of mental health conditions, a lot of different things. So that's what a person with a disability is under the ADA. For the employment prohibition, it's a discrimination against a qualified individual. That's an applicant or employee who can do the essential parts of a job with or without reasonable accommodation. So you can't be discriminated against if you're qualified to do the job. but you may need a reasonable accommodation to do the essential functions of the job. Let's go to the next slide. So what is a reasonable accommodation? First of all, I want to be clear that a reasonable accommodation is something that employers in most instances are going to be required to provide you. It is a floor. It's what is required to provide you. Lots of employers accommodate lots of employees with and without disabilities when there isn't a legal obligation to. So what we're talking about here is where the ADA requires a reasonable accommodation to be provided. A reasonable accommodation is any change or adjustment to a job or work environment that permits a qualified applicant or employee with a disability to apply for a job, perform the essential parts of a job, or to enjoy the benefits and privileges of employment equal to those enjoyed by employees without disabilities. So that is, that's a lot of words. What are we really talking about? Some of the things that a reasonable accommodation might include are making the workplace accessible for wheelchair users or people who are using other mobility devices or have mobility impairments. It may be a flexible work schedule. Flexible work schedules are the most requested accommodation by people with disabilities and by people without disabilities. Flexibility is very important to making work for a lot of people. Another reasonable accommodation is a reader or interpreter for people who are blind or deaf. Technology to make computers accessible, a software program, a special attachment on a computer that allows somebody to use it who has mobility impairments, and extended time to complete tasks. Those are examples of what might be a reasonable accommodation. So let's go to the next slide. This is what a lot of you are thinking. That's kind of interesting, Robin, but like really, what does that mean and how do I find out what might work for me? There is a free service provided by the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the U.S. Department of Labor called the Job Accommodation Network. The Job Accommodation Network is great. They have been around almost since the passage of the ADA. The ADA was passed in 1990. I think JAN's been around since 1991. They have vast expertise and they are free, and they will give you one-on-one practical guidance and assistance and information on job accommodation solutions. You can go to their website, askjan.org. And if if somebody's good at using the computer, you can sort by the type of disability that you have, the type of impairment you have, and see what might work for you. They have just a ton of information on that, really specifics about what can help people in different situations. You can also email them or you can call them and they will talk to you. I have used them in a variety of different situations, and they can give you, I mean, I've just been amazed by the prompt response that you get and how much detailed information that they can give you. Once for one of my sons, I needed information to help him draw chemical molecules for a chemistry class. He has issues with his hand, and they were able to give me a list of software programs that work to do this for you. I was just amazed, and I got that like within a couple hours. So they will talk to everyone. They'll talk to employers. If you're an employer, they can help you figure out what you can offer to what you might make available to one of your employees. Employees and job seekers can talk to them, family members, rehabilitation, medical, education, and other professionals. And they're known as the Job Accommodation Network, but if a student needs support for education, if you need support for accommodations just for your personal life or your recreational life, they will talk to you about it. I'm not usually this optimistic and positive, but they will give you a ton of different information that can be useful to you in figuring out exactly what it is that can accommodate this disability, your disability. So let's go to the next slide. So how do I ask for a reasonable accommodation? So there aren't magic words that you have to use to request an accommodation in employment. You just have to say that you just have to make clear to your employer what you're asking for. You don't have to use the magic words of reasonable accommodation. So here's the part that we really need to think about. One of the parts we really need to think about. Employers are required to provide accommodations for known disabilities. So to receive a reasonable accommodation, you'll have to explain to your employer that you need the accommodation because you have a disability. And if your disability and your need for accommodation isn't apparent or obvious, your employer can ask you to provide reasonable documentation about your disability, maybe a note from your doctor, and the need for accommodation. So you can make the request orally and in writing or both. If one of the things about making the request in writing is then you have a record that you've made it. But it's not required that you do it in writing. You can just ask for it. You need to ask an HR person or your supervisor or somebody who's in a position to speak for the employer. Let's go to the next slide, please. So when can I ask for a reasonable accommodation? You can ask for a reasonable accommodation at any time during the application process or during employment. If you need an accommodation to apply for the job, you need an interpreter for a job interview, if you need to have the interview take place in a space that's physically accessible, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation for the during the application process or during employment. It may be in your best interest to request a reasonable accommodation before any performance issues occur. You can ask for an accommodation at any time, but if you wait to ask until after performance issues in a job arise, the employer doesn't have to excuse the problems that happened in the past. They count as part of the person's performance. You have the right to the accommodation going forward, but this is something that requires some individual thought and consultation about when you want to disclose that you have a disability and you need an accommodation. This morning at the Employment First Summit, so that you all are getting the benefit of it, we had some conversations that really relate to the next slide. So if we could go there. The question is, do you need to disclose your disability to request a reasonable accommodation? And the answer to that, as I said earlier, is yes. If your disability or the need for the accommodation isn't obvious, you need to provide relevant information about your disability. You don't have to provide all of the details necessarily, but you have to provide the relevant information about the need for the accommodation. So we know, when we talked about this morning here at the Employment First Summit, decisions about disability disclosure can be complex, highly personal, something you want to put some thought into, in part because the information may be very personal to you, but also because there can be a stigma in some places about having a disability, and it's your personal decision about whether you want to share that. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today, but I wanted to share a resource, and there are other resources as well, but I've included here a link to a document that will help you think through some of the implications of sharing disability information from the Department of Labor. So that's what that link gives you: information about disclosure in the workplace, why, when, what, and how. This particular resource is geared towards youth in transition, but I think that the information they share is useful to anybody who wants to think this through at any point in their career. But the other thing I want to underscore, we can go to the next slide, is that disability-related information is private. So even if you make the decision to share your disability-related information with your employer to request an accommodation, Your employer has an obligation to keep the information confidential. It will be the disclosures that you need to make from your doctor or other information is required to be stored in a confidential files that are separate from your regular personnel records. So yes, the employer has the right to the information. If it is to use as justified by the business necessity of deciding the accommodation, they don't have the right to share it with everybody, and there are requirements under the law about keeping it confidential. So let's talk about, you've made your request. What are employers required to do? Employers, the requirement under the ADA and the DC law is to provide a reasonable accommodation unless providing the accommodation would create an undue hardship to the employer. And undue hardship is one that places significant difficulty or expense on the employer. So it's very hard to have hard and fast rules about what is and isn't a undue hardship, because it's going to vary based both on the size of the employer, the nature of the job, and how the accommodation impacts the job. So I'll give you an example. We talked about flexibility being an accommodation that is often requested. So in a lot of instances, it would not be an undue hardship for an employer to say, instead of working from 9 to 5, you can work from 9:30 to 5:30. But let's just say that your job is part of an assembly line. If everybody else is working from 9 to 5 and we can't start the work until you get there at 9:30, that might be an undue burden for the employer. Are there ways to manage things so that it can be done without that burden? That's something that we're going to talk about in the process of figuring out what accommodation works. If more than one accommodation would effectively meet the disability-related needs, the employer is the one who gets to choose which one to provide. Now, I want to underscore the word effectively in the prior sentence. It may be that there are a bunch of different accommodations that can accommodate a certain disability, but they also may not be all are not going to work as well as others for each person. So an example of this is if somebody is blind and needs to read something, understand what is in written work or on a computer, there may be a bunch of ways that you can effectively meet the disability-related needs. One might be a human being reading something. Another might be a computer software person that reads to you. It may be that in some circumstances, both of those are equally effective. But I've heard people talk about the fact where they've been offered human readers that if what is being read is highly technical, your average person isn't going to know those words and isn't going to be able to read it effectively for you. So that's an instance where an employee might say, the human reader is not effective for me. I really need the software program that reads it aloud to me because it knows the words. I can train it to be able to pronounce the right words. So but if they are both equally effective, it's the employer who gets to choose. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so you've made your reasonable accommodation request to your employer. What happens? One of the things that may happen is your employer may say, okay, and put the accommodation in place. But what happens when it's more complicated than that is that you and your employer are expected to participate in a flexible, what's called interactive process to clarify what you need and identify an appropriate reasonable accommodation. So when you make the request, your employer is required to respond promptly to the request and start that process. During that process, the employer can ask you relevant questions about the request, and you have a discussion about what the accommodation will look like and how it will help you do your job. And that process may go a few rounds, but ultimately, at the end of that process, you should have either have the accommodation in place or your your employer should make a determination that it would be an undue burden and decline it. And then either way, either with the process or with that determination, which would be unfortunate and which doesn't happen most of the time, but I just, want to mention that it's a possibility. That then the accommodation is put in place, and you can continue to have conversations about whether it's working well or not. So let's go to the next slide, please. So when are employers required to provide reasonable accommodations? As we've said, it's unless there's an undue hardship, are we repeating this slide? I think we've had this slide already. So. Do we have another slide? No, I think this is the thank you slide. So I'm going to take just a quick look and take any questions anybody has about reasonable accommodation. Does anybody are there any questions in the chat, or does anybody want to ask any questions? So one of the things that we talked a lot about this morning here, the first panel that we had this morning at the Employment First Summit was about reasonable accommodation. And the reason it was the first panel was that at last year's Employment First Summit, it was the last panel that we had, and people wanted to know more about reasonable accommodation. And we had a number of people with disabilities speaking about sharing information about their perspectives on when to ask for reasonable accommodation and when they don't ask for it. And I'll share some of that unless people have questions that you'd like me to answer, which I'd be happy to do. Just this thank you slide, my email address is here if you want to ask me anything. And then we can talk a little bit about resources in DC. I just want to share that the three people with disabilities who spoke on the panel this morning all said that their personal decision is they don't share information, they choose not to disclose information about their disability until they have a job offer. And then once they're offered a job, that's when they start to talk about reasonable accommodation. That I totally respect their experience with that, but do want to say that you want to make sure everybody knows that you are entitled to accommodations during the application process too. And that can be, and a lot of employers today will share information in their job application files about how you can get an accommodation in the process and things that you might need for that. I mentioned you might need an interpreter. Sometimes some employers now request that that people file their application in a kiosk. That kiosk may not be accessible to people for lots of different reasons. That should not discourage you from applying for a job. You should ask for a reasonable accommodation to apply without an online kiosk if that's what you need. So we don't want the barrier to be that just the process itself is inaccessible. People also this morning talked a lot about what happens if we get to the point that I said that the employer just says no accommodation. So if that happens, I will share, as many of you know, we have a couple of organizations in DC that are very actively working to advocate for and with people with disabilities and who might be able to provide you some really specific advice in your circumstance. And I will point you towards our colleagues at Quality Trust for Individuals with Disabilities, Disability Rights DC, and also in thinking through what accommodations you might want to use. That's something that if you're getting services from the Rehabilitation Services Administration, that they can talk to you about. They have expertise in that. We have our Technology First initiative in DC, and there's a lot of emerging technology that can be really useful to people in employment. Other things that, a couple other reasonable accommodations I want to talk about. There are people who benefit from having a job coach. Being able to have your job coach have access to your workplace is potentially a reasonable accommodation. If you have a personal care attendant or direct support professional, that person being able to have access to the workplace can be a reasonable accommodation. So we can think very creatively about what we can ask for reasonable accommodations. I had an experience once where I was working with someone who had dyslexia and dysgraphia. And one of the things that this person, who was a pretty senior employee, was going to have an assistant. And what this person was going to need is somebody who could edit his written work. So when we were interviewing for the assistant, we gave the applicants a sample. They didn't know that this what it was, a sample of this person's written work, and had them have a test of as part of the application process of whether they could effectively edit his written work. And so that's the way his reasonable accommodation was the ability to have somebody edit his work. There are circumstances where if somebody's job is as an editor, that's not going to be a reasonable accommodation. But for him, having the access to an editor was a reasonable accommodation. So again, varies depending on what it is. I want to just open it up again for questions from anybody. The PowerPoint is going to be available soon, as always. I am willing to take any questions. If not, I'm going to keep talking for a few more minutes about disability employment things that we haven't talked about. One of the things, we really want to be working on as we look to increase employment in DC is making sure that we're thinking really broadly about what jobs might work well for somebody, not thinking about as part of our person-centered planning process. And this should start, very young. We should have really high expectations of people and thinking big about what jobs people might be able to do. And also, I said at the beginning that what is a qualified individual with a disability is someone who can perform the essential functions of a job, the essential critical parts of a job, with and without reasonable accommodation. So when we're looking at this as a discrimination question under the ADA, there are some things which aren't that important to that aren't critical to a job, but that an employee may be asked to do. An example of this would be, let's say there's a receptionist in your office, and the receptionist's job is to answer the phone and transfer it to the right person and to greet guests. And you can do all of those things, but the receptionist also has the role of once a month getting the monthly birthday card signed. And that requires walking around the office, and there are some places that aren't accessible in a wheelchair, and because it's an old building and they should fix that anyway, but just, go with me on the example. So the essential functions of that job, I think it's pretty likely, are going to be found to be the phone part, the greeting the guest parts, and if somebody's qualified with or without reasonable accommodations to do those part, but for some reason, they can't do the part about getting the monthly birthday card signed, that's probably not going to be an essential function of the job. So they're qualified for the job. What we also talk about sometimes in trying to increase and improve disability employment is job carving. There are going to be some people who can do the part of that job that involves the telephone. They can't do the part of the job that requires greeting guests. for some employers, the job, the telephone part might be a job, but if it's a small employer and they really only have one receptionist, the person has to do both of those things. The employer might not be required to separate the two parts of that job into different jobs, but the employer can. So when we're advocating for disability employment, we can think about those kinds of things. And we can think about a job that's customized to what the person can do. Sometimes that might be required by the ADA, but sometimes that's something where what I said earlier really applies, that what the ADA provides is a floor, not a ceiling. And employers, for lots of different business reasons, might decide to do that job carving. It might make a lot of sense. So we can always think creatively beyond what the ADA requires and advocate for additional things. And, you know, sometimes that ends up working better for the employer. So don't, you know, just because something isn't required doesn't mean in our thinking creatively to help people get jobs and good jobs and advance in their jobs, we can always ask for more than that. And I know that's something that the professionals at the Rehabilitation Services Administration, at a lot of the providers who provide services both under DDA and RSA, that you're thinking about every day. And it's really important work. We've seen since we look, there are lots of employment statistics. We could spend some time looking at them another time if that's something we want to do. There is, since the pandemic, some growth in the employment rates of people with disabilities, and some of that is that remote work works really well for a lot of people with disabilities, and that has enabled people to get and keep good jobs who would have had issues with transportation or other things to work in an office. So we are seeing some progress, but we have a lot of room to continue to do that. So, you know, for those of you who are working in those areas, keep going. There's a lot of potential. And, you know, one of the things we want to do is we want to think broadly. We want to have really high expectations. We've seen that technology can make a really big difference. I'm excited. Last year or the year before at the Employment Summit, we had a presentation that I was really excited about from one of the technology companies that DDS works with, about remote job coaching, so that instead of having a job coach show up at your job site, once a month or twice a month or once a week, when somebody needs to reach out for a job coach, they can do that electronically through their computer. So it's not going to be the answer for everybody. These are all really individual things, but it just increases the potential of ways people can get the support and the accommodations that they need in a really person-centered way that may work not only just as well, but much better for them. If there's an issue in the workplace, negotiating with an employer, the ability to type on your computer or pick up your phone and ask the job coach that question right then can really help things. And the other thing, and we talked about this with accommodations, totally a personal decision about what you disclose and what you ask. And I'm not, not telling anybody what they should do, but really, if you may need an accommodation, if you start to see the need for an accommodation, there's a lot of advantage and good reason to ask early before problems might occur in your performance, or the employer doesn't know what's going on. Not waiting for problems to get worse is not, there are lots of reasons why that doesn't work well in life. That's something it took me a long time to learn, actually. So just, these are things you should be thinking about, and there are a lot of resources of people at providers at DDS, at Quality Trust, at DRDC, at ADA technical centers, lots of people around your personal, your family, your friends, your other paid and unpaid supporters who have experience, who can help you talk through how to say these things, how much you want to share. So people with disabilities, should feel comfortable asking for advice. People who are in the field should think about the advice that they want to offer. For employers, I talked about the Job Accommodation Network. The Office of Disability Employment Policy has a lot of resources on its website, both for employers. They have a project called EARN. There are a lot of organizations locally and nationally who are working to advance disability employment. So, take that out. And Andy wants to speak.
There's no price on these. We've been giving the groceries away for years. If it weren't free, we would have put a price on it. But
I just wanted to say one thing really quickly. It occurred to me, Robin, yeoman's effort there. I know who to invite if I need a whole lot of information about employment for people with disabilities. But I did want to make sure and make one mention today because November 5th is coming up, which is election day. And so just wanted to remind people that election day is coming up. And I've heard some rumblings out there about questions about who's allowed to vote. In DC, you can show up at a poll and register the same day. There is no limitation because a person has a guardian on their ability to vote unless a court makes a specific finding that the person lacks the capacity. And I could be wrong. I haven't heard of that ever happening. In DC. And so everyone should be aware an election is coming up. Provider staff are available to support people who need support to get to the polls and to vote. And voting early is always an option. Sandy Bernstein is usually here. She may be at the Employment First Summit, but ULS is also there. Disability Rights DC is very happy to assist anyone who needs support where there may have been any questions raised about a person's ability to vote.
And while we're talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a great disability rights leader, Justin Dart, who, as we say, of blessed memory. Justin passed away a number of years ago, but he is quoted as saying, "Vote as if your life depends on it, because it does." So voting is very important. If you have any issues with access, Disability Rights DC would like to hear about it if you have any issues accessing the polls, but it couldn't be more important. Please, vote. And if you need support, please ask for it. And somebody, Neha Patel, has written in that she's not aware of any time a court in DC has found that somebody can't vote. I also personally am not aware of it.
And Neha oversees, or at least monitors all of the guardianships of people supported by DDA who have a guardian, and has never seen this occur in DC. So people should just be aware. Election day is coming. The default is that you are able to vote. Early voting is available. Actually, early voting is available. People can go in and vote if they want to go vote early. All of us in DC received a ballot in the mail if you were registered. And as I said, if you're not registered, you can still go into the polls. They will assist you. If you have mobility issues, you can do curbside voting. There should be no reason that prevents a person who wishes to vote from being able to vote. We're told that they will be ready in 4 minutes. So does anyone have any questions or any other information to share? Maybe some, there may be people who are here who would want to share, like, good news examples of accommodations that have been provided that have been particularly effective. And I could, as we wait, I can think of one when I was doing a presentation with someone from Embassy Suites Hotel, which is one of the locations where we have our project search for hospitality. And the person who coordinated the supports for the youth that were doing their training there, he said the only accommodation that this young person needed was when he would be off for a few days, he wouldn't be clear about exactly what the job tasks were and in what order when he returned to work. But that once he got started, he knew what to do. And so one day they just followed him around, took pictures of each task that he did in order. And his accommodation was that he needed about 3 feet of wall space to put his pictures up. And he would come in after the weekend, look at the pictures, and get to work. And so, as Robin was saying before, an accommodation can be a very small thing that doesn't even feel like an accommodation. Or it can be something more complex. But generally speaking, and someone who knows could tell me when I'm mistaken here, accommodations typically cost less than $500. So the average accommodation is not something that is expensive for an employer. And it also tends to be something, you know, as you said, accommodations for people with or without disabilities. All of us have things that we're better at and not as good at work. Some of us may need help each time we go to the copier, remembering how to do particular things, and someone walks us through it. And no one suggests that that's some accommodation that's been provided. It's just kind of providing the support your coworker needs.
So we talk a lot about a lot of things very formally, because we want to make sure people get what they need, but a lot of it just happens naturally.
Because that's the issue with customized employment. To some degree, we all customize our jobs. Because we all are good at some things, contribute really well in certain areas and need help in other areas. And we informally work that out amongst ourselves.
And the good news is that different people and different employees in the workplace like different parts of the job. So if there's something I don't like to do, Andy might like to do it, and then it just evolves that way. Not just what I can do, but what you like to do.
Exactly. We're now seeing the room. That's real progress. And so it appears that most people are sitting down for lunch. So I'm hoping that means that they will be starting their presentation at any moment now.
So you're going to be joining the lunch for the presentation of awards this year. Every year at the summit, we have an opportunity for people to nominate people with disabilities and supporters who have done exceptional work, and we will be hearing about the people who are receiving the awards hopefully shortly.
So in case we cut away to them and then we end before getting back, I do want to thank you for all that great information, Robin. And as you said during the presentation, we do have the PowerPoint and it will be posted online. The address where to find that is in the chat for people that want to access that later, because it does include a lot of helpful information.
And I find that that's a link that is very helpful to bookmark on your computer, because I go to a lot of the presentations, and I find it one of the more useful links I've saved. So I recommend that.
And that one resource, the Job Accommodation Network, is amazing. That it's free and available and creative.
They are the most, I mean, I can't say enough good things about them. I've worked closely with them. over the years, they're also the group responsible for the Campaign for Disability Employment. Just, I mean, they do a lot of great work and presentations about accommodations in the ADA, but when you call them, they are so, or write them, they just are so prompt, so helpful. The knowledge is so deep. And just exploring their website for ideas, fabulous.
And free.
And free. Yes, oh, it's free. Actually, I view that as included. I think my tax dollars go to that. I don't know about, you know.
It looks like we are just about getting started there, right?
They're right.
Ah, and so are we.
There we go.
We could unmute them.
Audio check for your video. There we go. Unmuted.
So once again, so my name is Kevin White, and basically, I happen to be here with the awards luncheon with you all. So I want to thank everyone just to give me compliments about my outfit because I was getting so many compliments today. Basically, I know that like for myself, I choose these wild outfits so that like people would notice me, so that like basically so we get to like start quick conversations. I know that I always said that like for myself, I could be really an an introvert. And basically, I feel that like me going to conferences, meetings, I want everyone just to recognize me. So I want to thank you all again. So we're here just to recognize for the Employment First Champions Awards. These awards was placed in place for my amazing Employment First Planning Committee. We really want to honor or recognize difference makers who move the Employment First goals forward in DC. The awardees are individuals or organizations that have supported outstanding employment outcomes, served as role models for others working to achieve their career goals, or create a culture of inclusion, support, and excellence in the workplace. Today, we will be awarded 2 Trailblazing Awards. These awards recognize a person with a disability who have moved and innovator, transcender, and groundbreaker in their employment journey. The person has shown outstanding achievements which may include, but not is limited to, persevering to advancing the fields, earning work-related certifications, creating or leading employment-related affiliated groups, or serving as a role model for coworkers and others to work towards their dream goals. I first want to invite Chandra Conley up to present the first award. Is this good, Elijah? Oh. Allison, this week, that's you to read.
Is there something else I'm supposed to read? Am I just? Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. I am Chandra Conley. I'm with RCM of Washington. I'm the director of our Day in Employment Services. And I wanted to present this award to Ms. Nona Florence. She's a job coach. With RCM, she has been with RCM for the last 2 years, and she has been a great inspiration to the person that she supports. She actually supports a young lady who works at Homeland Security, the Coast Guard building over in Southeast. She's been supporting her for the last 2 years. The young lady that she supports has become Employee of the Month. She's also been able to be very independent. She's also been able to guide her to be socially aware and to be an advocate for herself. And so we are very proud to honor her today and to thank her for all her dedication and support for Ms. Constance, the person she supports. So. Thank you.
Thank you, Nana and Chandra. I want to invite next is Allison White to present the second award.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all again so much for being here. It's so great to see so many people and to be able to honor some of our trailblazers in our community and for all of you to get to know them a little better. So the next awardee, I conned him into coming here and tried to surprise him by asking if he would speak at the lunch. It's Matt McCullough, my good friend, and the director of the Office of Disability Rights. We wanted this to be a surprise. Matt is a true trailblazer. I knew I could ask him to come speak at the lunch and he would say yes. He's a big believer in employment and in being a role model for people. Anytime Matt has the opportunity to speak with students or speak with young people with disabilities about their careers, he always shows up for it. He is truly passionate about being a role model for people and leading the way and showing examples of what people with disabilities can achieve. He is the only member who has disclosed a disability in the mayor's cabinet, a huge achievement. That kind of leadership and representation is what changes our world. That is what shows people what is possible. And Matt is a true trailblazer, and I'm so happy to recognize him today.
Congratulations, Matt. Way to go, Matt. Way to go.
And I know Matt will have some great words to share with all of you because I told him to prepare something to speak about. Here he is.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, guys. I'm so very honored by this award, sir. But this day belongs to all of you because knowing that employment allows us to be independent, to give a good quality of life for ourselves and for our families. It's very important for us to be engaged and try to obtain employment. I realize that we experience several barriers to employment, such as very limited opportunities for training or internships. That's the reason why we have the Summer Youth Employment Program for our youth. I encourage all our students to engage in the Summer Youth Employment Program because it adds value to your resume and it also allows you to move forward in the cover jobs that you want going forward. I realize that there are challenges that you guys face, such as very limited access to transportation. I know that's a barrier. I also know that some of you are worried about getting reasonable accommodations on the job, but it's up to you to understand how do those reasonable accommodations allow you to actually perform the job. There are some resources that you can access. I really want to emphasize that for many of the students, there are requirements for you to get an actual transition plan, and that plan can be offered to the DC Rehab Services Administration. So all of you who are students here should be connected to the DC Rehab Services Administration, and they're here they have a table here. Also, if you need reasonable accommodations through the DC government, my agency helps you obtain those reasonable accommodations. At the end of the day, the theme for this year's National Disability Employment Awareness Month is Good Jobs for All. And it's up to all of us to get those good jobs that you want, because all of us add to the local and national economy. With that in mind, for all of you who are able to vote, go vote. You have the opportunity to vote. Thank you.
Now, I want to show a quick video before we move to the last piece of our lunch. Some of you have seen or heard of the Judith campaign, which is a communications campaign that the Developmental Disabilities Council has been doing, and we've been making videos with people with disabilities in honor of Judy Heumann, and one of Judy Heumann's goals to create space for disabled people to share their own stories and to share their lives, and for people without disabilities to benefit from all those contributions as well. So Matt made an awesome Judith campaign video for us. So I want to show that real quick, and then we'll move on to the last piece.
We were born into a world that has many mistakes, many falls. But we didn't create those falls, we didn't create those mistakes, but we have a responsibility to be willing to engage in those conversations, to make those positive changes that exist in our world.
The Judith Campaign, amplifying voices, honoring truth.
When I was growing up, I wasn't placed in in a special classroom or placed inside the so-called special education classroom. I was always integrated at the normal classroom. So I was always the only one with a physical disability. I use a wheelchair and a walker, and so I definitely stood out. But I realized that as I age, that I realized that there were other students like me, but they had hidden disabilities such as learning disability and so forth. And so I was never really alone, because disability is natural. If you're dealing with a learning disability, if you're dealing with like post-traumatic stress or cancer, all those are hidden disabilities. Then, reality, the majority of disabilities that are diagnosed and are in existence, like 85% of disabilities or hidden disabilities, that in many cases are acquired along person's lifetime. If you live long enough, you will acquire your disability. So disability is the X factor. It could truly bring people together if they're willing to listen and just place themselves in other people's shoes. And as an agency head of ODR, my purpose is to continuously bridge that understanding between people without disabilities. And my legacy will be based on how well did I communicate that it's upon us to really listen to other people's perspective, and that people have the authority, have the power within themselves to make the positive change that they seek.
So thanks to the amazing awardees. Now we have a special treat from Ann Deschamps, who will help us relieve some stress.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Good afternoon, everybody. How are we doing? Good, good. How many of you have heard of mindfulness before? Have any of you heard of mindfulness? Raise your hand, raise a high if you've heard. How many of you experience stress in your life? Okay, I should see every hand in here. I don't know a soul who does not experience stress. Mindfulness is a practice that includes techniques to help us relieve stress, okay? Now, when I say mindfulness, I know the bubble over everybody's head says something different, but it really is a bunch of different techniques, including walking meditation, sitting meditation, body scans, and other different tools that can help us relieve stress in our everyday life. And the great thing about mindfulness is it costs absolutely nothing, okay? So we're gonna practice a little mindfulness here. First of all, how many people have heard of meditation before? Yeah. How many people believe that meditation means you have to clear your thoughts? You have to clear your head of all thoughts. Yeah, that's a common misperception. And let me tell you right now, that is impossible. You cannot clear your head of all thoughts. The point is to watch your thoughts going by. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna do a quick 3-minute meditation that I'm gonna guide you through. And what I would like everyone to do is I would like you to be still, because the definition of mindfulness is paying attention on purpose, non-judgmentally to the present moment. So you're gonna be here now. You're gonna pay attention. You're not gonna plan what you're doing next. You're not gonna think about what just happened. You're gonna live in the present moment. And the problem is that most of us are so busy either talking like these guys are, or remembering something, or planning something, or trying to figure out how to get back at somebody who did something wrong to us, that we're missing the present moment. So what I'm about to show you is one way to be in the present moment, okay? And so if everybody can sit in a comfortable position, if you're not already that way, and there are going to be people talking while I'm doing this, and that's okay, it's no problem. And if you can take a few deep breaths in and let it go. Another deep breath in, let it go. And if you'd like, you can close your eyes or you can leave them open, whatever you prefer. But if you leave them open, if you could focus on one point. Taking another deep breath in. Now I'd like you to pick an anchor to focus on. And the anchor can be your breath coming in through your nose and exhaling. So you can choose to focus on your breath. One thing that would be really easy to focus on is the sounds around us with all the people talking. So focusing on the sounds. And maybe you can even focus on your breath and the sounds at the same time. The other option for an anchor is your feet on the ground, your seat in the chair, your arms in the lap, feeling your feet on the ground, your arms in the chair, your seat on the ground. So let's take a minute and pick your anchor, maybe your breath, maybe the sounds, maybe the feeling of your seat where you're sitting. And every time you get pulled away by thoughts, which you will, I want you to come back to your anchor. So if it's the sounds, come back to the sounds. If it's your breath, come back to the breath. Thoughts will come, as I'm sure they are, like, what is this woman doing and why am I doing this? And that's okay. The mission of thoughts is to distract us from the present moment, honestly. Again, coming back to the anchor as you're pulled away, knowing that this is very, very normal. Bringing your focus back to your breath or the feeling of your seat in the chair and your feet on the ground. Remembering it's okay to get pulled away by the distractions. And when you think about it, think of all the distractions we have in our lives. The phones that some of you are looking at right now, the computers you're looking at, the voices that you're hearing. When you think about all those distractions, they're all pulling you away from this present moment right here, right now. All right, as you are comfortable, you had your eyes closed, opening them up, taking in your surroundings, taking a few deep breaths. How do you feel? Better? Thumbs up if you feel better. Yeah. So honestly, you guys, seriously, mindfulness doesn't necessarily have to be a 45-minute meditation, although it could be. It can be as much as a minute of quiet, where you pick an anchor, you focus on the anchor, and bring your attention back to the anchor when it goes away. And if you can do this a few times a day, it's amazing the difference it'll make. In fact, there are empirical studies that show as little as 3 minutes of mindfulness, which is what we just did, a day, makes a difference in the quality of life. Because what's happening is we're all getting pulled by the distractions, particularly our devices. They pull us away, and it's entirely normal. It's an integral part of our culture, right? But guess what? We are in charge of our attention, all right? So we have to be very mindful about where we put our attention. And mindfulness is a technique to help us make better choices. Choices about where we're going to put our attention. So I would like to send you into the afternoon with a little more relaxation. And just remember, when you feel like you're about to lose it, completely stressed out, it can be as simple as coming back to this present moment, because it's all we have. It's all we have. And if you can bring your attention to the present moment, it can give you enough perspective to move on with a different attitude. Thank you, Allison, for giving me the opportunity to do this.
Yes, I feel better. Yeah. Thank you so much, Anne. That was wonderful. I'm going to pass it back to Kevin to close us out.
So I want to thank everyone who attended our awards lunch, and breakout session will be starting back at 1:45 on the 4th floor. And also, I want to get another reminder to make sure to fill out your evaluation surveys. That's in your little packet, that's in your folder. Basically, so we just want to make sure that like we value you all's feedback, so that like next year's into the.
I like the Wagoneer though, the new Wagoneer.
Just make it better anyway. So thank you all, and see you at 1:45 on the 4th floor.
For people who are still here with us in the DDS room, just wanted to let people know, well, first of all, thank you for joining us. I think that went pretty well. Each year during November and December, we combine those 2 months. So we won't have a November forum, and our December forum will be a little bit early. Our December forum will be on December the 13th. And so have a happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Enjoy the rest of National Disability Employment Awareness Month. I hope to see many people next week at the Mayor's Disability Employment Fair. So have a great weekend, and we will see you all in December. Thank you.